All right, so we've been working our way through Genesis. We're continuing now. We've seen the flood. The water has receded. Noah has exited the ark, and we've been in the middle of the Noahic covenant. We talk about different covenants of the Bible. We have the Adamic covenant. Comes along with creation mandate, fill the earth, subdue it. We have the Noahic covenant as our next covenant of the Bible, and it's in part a reiteration of the Adamic covenant. One thing that has changed, God still said, be fruitful, multiply, fill the earth. We're starting over, so you guys get busy. We got to get this earth filled up. Then he says the fear of you is going to come from the animals. That seems to be something new. And everything that moves, that lives, shall be food for you. And what's really interesting about this is that the Noahic covenant, unlike a lot of other covenants, seems to step ahead and then we step back, because the Mosaic covenant is going to pull away from those dietary restrictions, or is going to add dietary restrictions. Noah was told, whatever you want to eat it. And then by the time Moses comes along, only eat the clean animals. Noah knew what the clean animals were, but he was allowed to eat whatever he wanted. That's interesting to me. I don't have an explanation as for why that is. And so we saw that, here we go. Going to the next piece. He did make prohibitions concerning blood. Don't eat blood in your animals. And that's not the same as the red that's in a steak. I don't remember the scientific term for that, but there's a red color that comes in meat. Naturally, it's not blood. By all practical purposes, anything that you and I buy from a butcher or a market has been bled. The way animals have been killed pretty much throughout history is they're bled out. When I was growing up and we killed a lot of our own animals, that's what you do. You bleed them out. You know, you shoot a pig in the head and you cut his jugular immediately thereafter and he bleeds out on the ground. That's, sorry, kind of a little too graphic for some of us. Chicken, we cut their heads off. That was the way we did it. And they flop around and bleed out. That heart will pump. That blood will empty. Even when you're hunting. It's not always easy to bleed out an animal when you're hunting, because by the time you get to him, sometimes he runs off and bleeds himself out. Sometimes he drops graveyard dead and you can't really bleed him out. We'll soak that meat. I'll put that deer on a big ice chest full of ice, and I'll leave him in there for 3 days and soak all the blood out of that meat. So that's what God was asking for there. Now, we didn't go into this last week, but one of the questions that comes up is, does that prohibition still stand? I haven't seen the exact reversal of that prohibition in Scripture, except I think generally you could argue that it's probably no longer in effect for 2 reasons. One, Jesus, while he was still under the law, did not speak very articulately about such things. He talked about the food for the body for food, God will destroy them both. Peter was told to eat all kinds of unclean things. Don't call unclean what God has made clean. And so there does not seem to be any dietary restrictions again. Maybe the interesting point of that is that Adam's progeny's failure, except for Noah, resulted in destruction. The reiteration resulted in freedom. And now we're going to again go to the law of Moses, which is going to point out the nature of sin, going to point out God's requirements for sin, and then the end of the law of Moses, once again, return to freedom. Just a thought. So, no blood in the meat, and he said that basically he instituted the blood for blood capital punishment of taking the life of a man. This is God's institution. For your lifeblood, I require a reckoning in verse 5. From his fellow man, I require a reckoning from the life of man. Whoever sheds blood of man, by man shall his blood be shed, for God made man in his own image. So that's where we ended up. So we're picking up now in verse 8, chapter 9, verse 8. So now we're continuing the covenant. Verse 8, he says, Then God said to Noah and his sons with him, Behold, I establish my covenant with you and your offspring after you, and with every living creature that is with you, the birds, the livestock, and every beast of the earth with you. As many as came out of the ark, it is for every beast of the earth. So this is a whole earth covenant, or we might say a whole life covenant. Everything surviving the flood, what follows here is for them. He doesn't mention marine life. He doesn't mention microscopic life, which they would not have known of, so it wouldn't have made sense. But everything that lived through the flood, which is everything that lives now, is party to this covenant. The nature of the covenant is verse 11. He said, I will establish my covenant with you, that never again shall all flesh be cut off by the waters of the flood, and never again shall there be a flood to destroy the earth. Now that's a pretty specific declaration. In chapter 8, we saw God thinking to himself, that he wouldn't flood the earth again. He makes that a promise. Never again will all flesh be cut off by the waters of the flood. And it's interesting that it is the flood, not a flood. But the idea of that is a flood that is going to be of the magnitude of this one. And never again shall a flood destroy the earth. So he says specifically a flood won't destroy the earth itself. Specifically that all flesh won't be cut off by a flood. So that leaves some room. We still see floods. We see life ended by floods. God didn't say life wouldn't be ended by floods. He didn't say floods wouldn't happen. He said all life won't be eradicated like it was, which was all but one of everything, one male, one female. And never again will the whole earth be flooded. So every flood we've seen since has been regional. And this is an unconditional covenant. When we talk about covenants, we talk about prophecies, we talk about God making statements to his people. They come in two forms, conditional and unconditional. Conditional means if you meet these criteria, then I will do this. That is the prophetic template that God gave Moses and every prophet since Moses. If you serve me, if you uphold my word, you do the things I command, then I will prolong your days, I will make your life in the land great, I'll make you prosperous, I'll bless you. But if you turn against me, if you turn to false gods, if you do the things that I've called you not to do, then I will judge you. I'll cut you off from the land. I'll make you a slave, and another people will carry you away. That template is all through the Old Testament. That's conditional. This is unconditional. God doesn't say if. He doesn't say unless. He says, this is my covenant, never again shall. So unconditionally, no matter what you do, I'm never again going to flood the old earth. I'm never again going to wipe out all flesh on the earth by a flood. Interestingly enough, the time will come that God will wipe out all flesh on the earth that remains. At that point, it'll be a final battle between Christ and Satan. The people of Christ will not be wiped out, strictly speaking, but the earth and everything on it will be, because he's going to consume the entire creation at that point. All of us become floaty with the Lord, and he builds a new earth, and heaven proper comes down on that new earth, and we all go and inhabit that for eternity. So he's not saying the earth won't end. He's saying I'm not going to flood it again. No requirements given to man whereby God will keep his word here. He's simply going to do it. And then he gives a sign of the covenant. Verse 12, God said, this is the sign of the covenant I make between me and you and every living creature with you for all future generations. I have set my bow in the cloud, and it shall be a sign of the covenant between me and the earth. When I bring clouds over the earth and the bow has been set in the clouds, I will remember my covenant between me and you and every living creature of all flesh, and the water shall never again become a flood to destroy all flesh. When the bow's in the clouds, I will see it and remember the everlasting covenant between God and every living creature of all flesh that's on the earth. And God said to Noah, this is the sign of the covenant that I have established between me and all flesh on the earth. A lot of redundancy in our Old Testament narratives. Some of that was because of repeatability, so that before writing was developed, it could be remembered properly. But he says, here's the sign. We didn't have a sign in the Adamic covenant. We do have a sign here. There's going to be a sign for the Abrahamic covenant. That's going to be circumcision. But here, the sign is the rainbow, the sign of the covenant. And one of the questions that gets asked here is, did God invent the refractory ability of water that day to create Roy G. Biv? Y'all remember Roy G. Biv? Red, orange, yellow, blue. Red, orange, yellow, green, blue, indigo, violet, the colors of the spectrum, the refractory properties of water vapors in the sky that generate that spectrum for us and make the rainbow scientifically. Did God create that ability then? I don't think he had to, because no flood had come upon the earth before then, and no rain had fallen on the earth before then. So there was never really an opportunity for that post-rain mist to have revealed itself. I think that that was probably always there in God's sovereignty. But this is the sign, and that's going to be the rainbow, the sign of the covenant. We're moving pretty quick through this section because of the redundancy and the simplicity. So now we move into something that might generate some good conversation. Good question. I would imagine with proper magnification. I don't know. The problem with the rainbow is it's so localized. You know, we move around and it's still there, but we're seeing the results of all of the mist from all this water. And if you zoom out, you know, you're 70,000, 80,000 miles away, can you see it? I don't know.
Well, and we see it, you know, is this because of the shape of the earth? From there, would it look like a bow?
I would think it would be a full circle. If you get your sprinkler on a fine mist and you spray out, you can see a full circle rainbow with it, you know, and if you get the light just right. And there may even be, there's some sort of halo around the earth from outer space. I don't know that anyone's zoomed in enough to know if that's the colors of the spectrum or not. Anybody know? Interesting question.
I've seen double rainbows.
I've seen doubles. Mm-hmm. I've seen vivid doubles, you know, which is really unique. As soon as they invite me on a space shuttle, I will let y'all know if my wife will let me go.
Think of that in the Artemis mission, they talked about that they got some really magnificent pictures of the Earth.
Oh, yeah.
Like we haven't seen yet, of course.
I bet we have better pictures of the Earth than we've ever gotten because of the advance in photography, if for no other reason. Oh, interesting. Okay. So, new subject. We'll talk about Noah's progeny, and the big bullet, the big heading here is the cursing of Canaan. The sons of Noah who went forth from the ark were Shem, Ham, and Japheth. Ham was the father of Canaan. These three were the sons of Noah, and from these the people of the whole earth were dispersed. Noah began to be a man of the soil, and he planted a vineyard. He drank of the wine and became drunk, so that he lay uncovered in his tent. And Ham, the father of Canaan, saw the nakedness of his father and told his two brothers outside. Then Shem and Japheth took a garment, laid it on both their shoulders, walked backwards and covered the nakedness of their father. Their faces were turned backwards and they did not see their father's nakedness. When Noah awoke from his wine and knew what his youngest son had done to him, he said, "Cursed be Canaan, a servant of servants shall he be to his brothers." He also said, "Blessed be the Lord, the God of Shem, and let Canaan be his servant. May God enlarge Japheth, and let him dwell in the tents of Shem, and let Canaan be his servant." After the flood, Noah lived 350 years. All the days of Noah were 950 years, and he died. I want to say he is the second, pretty close to the second oldest lifespan ever, minus Methuselah. And I may be missing one in there. As we go through, we'll see. But I think that we're at the second longest living man in history. So this is an interesting account. There's probably a lot here that we really can't understand fully. But we see the sons of Noah, Shem, Ham, Japheth, and the fact that Ham was father of Canaan. They're listed in their birth order. Shem's the eldest. Ham is the middle. Japheth is the youngest. Poor middle guy, never gets a break. Ham, being the father of Canaan, put in sort of parenthetical hindsight, it seems, by editors, but rightly so, because the story really has a lot to do with what became of Canaan. And we'll talk about the land of Canaan in chapter 12 if we go to chapter 12. We were going to stop at 11, and we'll see how we feel when we get to 11. From these people, the whole earth were dispersed. That is naphats, literally broken into pieces or scattered. The idea humanity once again separates into its different areas. So it says Noah was a man of the soil. He had certainly an indiscretion. I think it's put together here as an indiscretion. He was the first to plant a vineyard. The Hebrew word order there is important. Because all it says here is, I think this is NIV that I'm reading from here. These are old ESV. These are older notes when I was in ESV for a few years. ESV says, Noah began to be a man of the soil and he planted a vineyard. The HCSB says Noah, a man of the soil, was first to plant a vineyard. And the Hebrew word order actually matters here. It says, began Noah, a man of the soil, to plant vineyard. It seems to indicate that Noah at this time became a husbandman rather than him being the first to plant a vineyard. You can argue that. I don't know that it's that important. But the word began here indicates that prior to the flood, Noah wasn't a farmer. I don't know what he was, but he wasn't a farmer. The last couple hundred years, he was a carpenter, or 120 years. So generally it's proposed that Noah sinned here by getting drunk from the vineyard. And that very well may be true if, in fact, Noah knew the sinfulness of drunkenness. We don't have a prohibition against drunkenness. Maybe he did. Again, what we don't know about how God revealed himself to the antediluvian people, or really pre-Mosaic people, is a mystery. We know that they knew some things, but we don't know how they knew what they knew, and we don't know the distinctions between what they knew and what later became the Mosaic covenant, because we see distinctions. So maybe his failure here was his drunkenness, but we don't have a biblical account of that knowledge. And if this text is actually referring to the first vineyard, and no one had planted a vineyard before and had an abundance of grapes before, it's possible Noah might have been the first one to get drunk on wine, not knowing what would become of these grapes. I know how to make wine. My family made wine. My grandmother made wine. I have made wine. There, I said it out loud. I think I've told you that before. It's not hard to do. To typically make it, all you need is grape juice, sugar, and water. But you can actually make a form of it with just grape juice. If it's a particularly sweet vine and you leave it alone long enough, it'll start to ferment. I've actually, in restaurants, as probably have you, put ketchup on my French fries and took a bite of that ketchup and realized this is ketchup wine. It's been here way too long, and it's got that fermented flavor. Anything will almost ferment. It's a process of rotting. The question is, does it have the acidic content to keep it from truly rotting, or is it going to ferment and turn sugar into alcohol? So grapes on their own can do that. It's possible that this is the first drunkenness ever. The text doesn't make mention of Noah being in a sinful state through the ordeal. It doesn't say that, Noah was the guy that God elected out of everybody, that was doing right by God, and all of a sudden now he's got this horrible, he's rebelled. We don't see rebellion in the text. Just that he either was the first to plant a vineyard, or it was the first time he started planting things and he made a vineyard. We just don't know which way this is supposed to be understood. Yes, sir.
I mean, the flood, being it was the first time they saw rain, and then now we're post-flood.
Mm-hmm.
There had to be some kind of an ecological shift in the planet.
Oh, surely.
So,
massive.
How were plants grown pre-flood versus post-flood?
Mm-hmm.
Maybe grapes. Maybe there was, I don't know. I'm just
Might not have been enough, water for grapes to grow anywhere than by a creek side.
I'm just
Yeah.
tossing it out there, but I think that there was definitely some kind of an ecological change in the environment henceforth.
Yeah. It's possible. I think it's possible. So, if it's the first vineyard, maybe it's the first drunkenness. It's the first mention of it, of both of them, but we don't know for sure. So the text doesn't mention him, though, being sinful here. In fact, what really happens through history is that the curse Noah speaks to Ham is actually carried out. So if Noah's in a sinful place and he puts a curse on Ham through Canaan, God honors his curse, for reasons that don't make sense if he was, in fact, the one who was wrong in rebellion. So it doesn't seem from the text that Noah intentionally did anything wrong here. He just became drunk and lay uncovered in his tent. Who knows why people do what they do when they're drunk? I don't think anybody does. Drunkenness for me has not been a thing. I tried it twice in high school, once out of curiosity, once out of rebellion, and both times I decided, no, that's not for me. I have no interest in drunkenness. I feel drunk right now because of vertigo, and I don't like it. I don't like it one bit. So that's not something I'm signing up for intentionally. So him experiencing that, I know that alcohol and drunkenness inhibit, your inhibitions are affected, and you don't care about things maybe you should care about. For whatever reason, he ended up naked, laying in his tent naked. That's embarrassing in the least. Sinful, again, we don't see any indication that Noah willingly sinned here. And the Bible's very careful to point out the sins of our heroes. We see the sins of our heroes. We see David and Bathsheba and Peter and the Gentiles. And so the Bible doesn't cover up the sins of our heroes. We certainly see Abraham making some sinful decisions here and there. And so it doesn't seem that, again, his intent was off, that he rebelled against God. He's basically in his tent. And I'll be honest, a part of the whole story is a mystery to me. The idea of my father being naked in his tent, I would be embarrassed for him and I would cover him up, but I wouldn't walk in backwards. I don't know. I don't want to speak on behalf of everybody, but I've seen my dad naked before. When I was a little toddler, It's not like it was a daily thing, but, you open the bathroom door, there's Dad. Oh, sorry, Dad. You're a little kid. I don't understand what was such a big deal to them, but they went to extreme measures. And I don't think that it was necessarily the sinful idea of seeing their father naked as it was wanting to honor their father. Now, that also has not been written yet to our knowledge, but they were, it seems, exhibiting the intent of what later became the law and not wanting to disrespect their father, wanting to honor their father, so they walk in backwards. But Ham got there first. So Ham, we see him again mentioned as the father of Canaan. That's said twice. That's not without reason. There's an association between Ham and Canaan because the curse given to Ham is later going to be seen carried out on the Canaanites. And we're not going to drill into that much more than that for now. But I can tell you that when God called Israel to gather out of Egypt, they were to eradicate the Canaanites. God called on them to eradicate the Canaanites. They never pulled it off successfully, and the Canaanites were a thorn in their side forever. We just finished on Wednesday night the book of Zechariah, and one of the last things Zechariah says is in the kingdom period, it doesn't say that phrase, but that's what it's describing, there will be no Canaanite in the land of Israel. Now, that's an interesting thing to say. After all of human history, there will be no Canaanite in the land of Israel. At that time, on Wednesday night, some of us were in there, some of us weren't. What's interesting is, I want to say, modern Jews and Arabs, on average, have 50% Canaanite DNA in their blood today. So how do you eradicate the bloodline? Well, I don't think it's about the bloodline. I think it's about the rebellious nature of Canaanism or the Canaanites, which, again, we're connecting that to Ham here and this action here. At this point, we have to turn to what's called biblical theology. We're not going to get a good answer using systematic theology. Systematic theology looks at drunkenness, looks at nakedness, looks at rebellion as subjects and tries to build a full profile picture on those subjects. I am a systematic theology magnet. I love systematic theology. That's one of my passions. It's why I teach theological subjects. But biblical theology is sort of the theology of the story, for lack of a better way to package it. Biblical theology is not about subjects as they are mentioned in the text, but it's about processes, it's about procedure, it's about the story of God's overall program, it's about kingdom movement, and they're both very important, and I also love biblical theology. But here we really need to lean on biblical theology. we're being introduced to Ham, we're being introduced to Canaan, and both in a negative light. As the story goes on, Ham ends up in a negative light, Canaan ends up in a negative light, and so the bigger story is how we flesh out these early introductions. And by the way, written by Moses at a time when the knowledge of those Canaanites and Ham's story were going to be pertinent to those people who are in the wilderness getting ready to enter the promised land, and they're going to meet up with who? A whole slew of Canaanites. So all of that's part of biblical theology and the story of it as to why probably its relevance is put here. So Ham goes in and he sees. That word is ra'ah. It means see in the sense of noting something with the eye, but it also means to see in the sense of observing and studying. He didn't walk in and see that and go, oh, and then turn aside. He went in and apparently looked and apparently thought there was something there to mock, something there to deride, because instead of doing the right thing himself, which he could have done, cover your daddy up and keep your mouth shut. That's all he had to do. Nobody would ever have known of this, you know. It's what I would have done. It's what you would have done. It's not what he did. He went and told his brothers. Now, it doesn't tell us how he told his brothers. It just says he told his two brothers outside. That seems to be the action that brought the curse on him. He saw, and he could have done what was right, but instead he chose to tell his brothers. And the feel of that is that it was gossipy. We define gossip theologically as idle speak. Something I know that I'm going to tell you, but we're not really solving problems with this. We're just talking about stuff we know and feeling good because we have a choice morsel that we can share with other people. And oftentimes at the disdeem of someone else, oftentimes to cause someone else shame or guilt or to somehow besmirch them. And that seems to be what is at play here. We see Shem and Japheth responded the way we would think would be right to respond. Go cover your father up. And they went way beyond, even walking in backwards, so that they didn't look upon their father because they knew he was in there naked. And those two ended up blessed, and Ham ended up cursed through Canaan. So it seems that his offense here is mentally sinful derision of his father, shaming his father by telling his brothers instead of taking care of it himself and keeping that all a secret. And don't forget, the population of the world right now is what, 10? You know, you got those 8, and we know of 9. We have Noah, Mrs. Noah, the 3 boys and their wives, and Canaan. That's all we know of. There might be some others by now, but it's a very small world. And he chose to go tell the story rather than to just let it lie. So they basically corrected Ham's error, covering their father in such a way so as not to shame him any further. And then we see the curse of Canaan. Noah awoke and knew what his youngest son had done. Awoke, the idea of that is he sobered up and got up and knew. That word is yada. Indicates knowledge, but not the source of knowledge. I don't know that it's saying Noah woke up knowing. I think it's saying he woke up, sober up, and he knew in some way at some point. I don't know the timing of that. Some translations say when he learned, and that's fair, what his youngest had done. Now, what's interesting here is his youngest isn't necessarily the right term for translation here, because Shem was the oldest, Ham was the middle son, and Japheth was the youngest. So the word katan here is the word small. 33 times it's translated small, 15 times it's youngest, 14 times it's younger. So youngest and younger combined is less of a translational reality than just the word small. And so it's entirely possible here that youngest is just not the best translational term. It's smallness. He was small in what he had done. And so Ham's action was clearly the offense that Shem and Japheth knew. Noah now knew it also. And he said, cursed be Canaan. Now the question is, why Canaan? Yes, sir. Your question first.
Just what I was going to ask.
That's the first thing you think. I can tell you that in biblical theology, there's a change coming. Early on in biblical history, God often cursed children and grandchildren down to the 5th generation, he says, of those who did wrong. And then a time comes when God says, no longer will it be said that the children are cursed for the father. The fathers eat sour grapes and the children's teeth are set on edge. God changes that. Why? I don't know. When that happens, neither of those has happened yet. This is too early in history for either of those to be in effect. But again, we see a lot of things in pre-flood, antediluvian history that we see later understood, and clearly they were earlier understood, and we just don't know how they knew what they knew. But it seems to fit the narrative that in the most ancient of histories, the cursing of the child was an appropriate response, it seems, to the sin of the parent, which should make us all shudder, the fact that we might end up cursing our children from our wrongdoing. Of course, we live in grace through faith in the risen Christ. We don't have that fear. But back in this day, that was not an unusual thing. But you got to ask it, why? Why in the world curse Canaan?
Well, how often who as a parent has not said, you wait till your kids treat you the way that you're treating me and you're going to understand, is that not?
Saying that you're going to get this back one day.
Right.
That's possibly a part of it. Canaan, as far as we know, was innocent of any of this. I don't think, it doesn't say Canaan went in and saw his granddaddy and went back to his daddy and said, granddad's naked in there, go look, daddy. Canaan's not even part of the story, but he receives the curse. It is possible that Canaan was at fault here as well, and we just don't know how. Twice now in the text, we're told Ham, the father of Canaan, Ham, the father of Canaan. Obviously, we're setting up the narrative so we understand the later detrimental future for the Canaanites. And we see here where it came from. I don't know that we're going to comfortably or satisfactorily come to an understanding of why. I don't think we're given that here. Now, the rabbis thought that Canaan was there with his father and saw his grandfather naked and was somehow an instigator. Don't forget the rabbis also thought that, if there were 2,000 rules for the Sabbath. So the rabbis came up with some crazy stuff and remain so today. The rabbis thought a lot of things that were not part of biblical theology, but that's what they thought. We just don't know. Some people would suggest, some commentators have suggested, that Noah couldn't bring himself to curse his own son, so he cursed his son's son. But from what I know of grandparentism, you'd much rather curse your child than your grandchild. That's the way I hear it, that grandchildren are way better than children. Everybody that's reported to me. I haven't had the experience yet. So, interestingly enough, the word Canaan means humiliated in the Hebrew. So, lastly, it is possible the reference to Canaan means that Ham was cursed to the youngest of his children. We later learn he had 4, and Canaan was the youngest, so there goes my answer from a while ago. There were at least 12 on the earth at that time. So this is likely that he's being singled out from him to the other, because God talks in terms of generational curses later. Don't know. But the curse was committed to Canaan as Ham's surrogate, or as the namesake of his entire line after him, if you would. And it says the curse was, he'll be a servant of servants to his brothers. That word is ach, and it has a lot of applicational kindred ties. His kin, it could be at its widest, his brothers at its narrowest. I don't think it is narrowing his servitude just to his brothers. He clearly talks about Shem and Japheth and their lines to follow. So it's the broader understanding of ach, that he is to be a servant to his kin. The word servant is ebed. We talked about that last Sunday. The Isaiah 42, 49, 53, the servant of the Lord passages in Isaiah. That was Christ. Christ was the servant of the Lord. The word servant means a slave, one that is totally devoted to someone else's mission. And it's doulos in the New Testament. we are called slaves of Christ. So the idea of being a servant isn't necessarily a bad thing, but in this case, he is a servant who isn't a chosen servant, not a purchased servant like we are, not a willing servant like we are, but one who is condemned into servitude by those who are not going to probably be people that you would want to be servants of. So literally, servant of servant means a slave's slave. The idea is that you aren't just a slave, you're a slave's slave. You're such a low slave that another slave owns you. So somebody owns a slave, and that slave owns you. You're demoted even beyond just being a slave. It's a very, very lowly criteria. And this came to fruition in several ways. Genesis 14, we'll get to later. We see one. In Solomon's day, we see another. In 1 Kings 9:20, all the people who were left of the Amorites, the Hittites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites, who were not of the people of Israel, their descendants who were left in the land, who the people of Israel were unable to devote to destruction, these Solomon drafted to be slaves, and they are so to this day. So all of those ites you hear, those are the people of Canaan. Those are the Canaanites. And not all strictly descended, well, I guess they're probably all strictly descended of Canaan, but they all developed their own nations later, but they all follow themselves back. But then we see a blessing to Shem and Japheth. Noah, speaking, also said, "Blessed be the Lord, the God of Shem, and let Canaan be his servant. And may God enlarge Japheth, and let him dwell in the tents of Shem, and let Canaan be his servant." So, what Shem and Japheth did was indicative of God's ways in Noah's eyes. They did right. He blesses them and says, let Canaan be their servant. And he adds for Japheth to enlarge his territory, the idea of a fruition of his offspring. And indeed, they will fill Asia and Europe, the Japhethites, the largest of the three as history unfolds. I don't know that we're going to get into all of that here. Let him dwell in the tents of Shem. The idea of that is Shekan means to live or abide with. Tents is the living place, the dwelling place. He's basically calling for fellowship between those two brothers, and he's excluding the fellowship of Ham and Canaan. Let Canaan be the servant. So the Canaanites are cut off from the fellowship of the Canaanites, and the Hamites are cut off from the Shemites and the Japhethites. So as we look, and I've got a little map here, we look at Shem and Ham and Japheth. Ham ends up being the Cushites in Egypt. He ends up being, I can barely see this, Put in Libya. They end up going south into some Egyptian areas that have some notoriety early on, but are later cursed. Egypt was cursed, I think, in Ezekiel, that they're going to be forevermore a backward people. It's a fascinating curse, because what do you think of when you think of Egypt? Do you think of the pharaohs and the great libraries at Alexandria? Or do you think of a backward people who everything they do seems to turn to powder, and they just can't ever, all the wealth of that nation that they had, all the opportunity they had through history, and now they can't even hardly agree on a leader. So that's kind of the progeny that became of Ham. And we'll maybe, if we keep going, deal in some more of that later. I'm going to skip all that. After the flood, Noah lived 350 years, and all of his days were 950 years, and he died. So I've only got 11 minutes, but I want to go ahead and get started on the next Toledah. Oh, yeah, well, we might have 11 minutes worth of questions. Yeah, go ahead.
So let me ask you something, because there's nothing recorded, anything that Noah did after this fall, this sin.
Mm-hmm.
Okay? And I think that to be a few hundred years later than we hear he dies. So there's a silence there.
It was. Mm-hmm.
But like I said, there's nothing recorded from what we just went over till now he's dead.
Right.
Why do you think?
Honestly, I don't make anything of that, because that's the way it has been. Same with Adam. You know, we go from Adam to his children. We don't hear about Adam anymore. Then we go, you know, Cain and Abel. Then you have Seth. And we follow. Moses is telling can't believe I'm going to say this out loud. I hate this phrase, but it's the right phrase in this context, a framing narrative. And I hate that phrase because that's the word liberals use to try to discredit the Scripture. It's just a framing narrative. It's a worldview picture for people. It's more than that, but it's not less. So the idea of a framing narrative is Moses is writing to the Israelites. And the Israelites are his people through Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Now Jacob. We're all of Jacob's people. And that came from Isaac. And that came from Abraham. And that came all the way back up through Seth to Adam. And so we're writing the story for the sake and for the benefit of the Israelites. And there are parts of that story that just don't matter so much to them, right? And so when we get to a certain point, we tell a couple stories, and then we move to the next generation. And we tell a couple stories, we move to the next generation. That's kind of been the way it's been. I don't think there's a special reason that Noah didn't get more airplay here.
Well, and I know that, you know, we're not getting there in this study, but when we get between the Old Testament and the New Testament, there's around 400 years.
Mm-hmm.
We know things did historically, you know, Alexander the Great. We know there's things that happened during that time.
Mm-hmm.
It's not recorded in the Bible.
Correct.
Though I think there was a part in Daniel that kind of alludes to what might
More than alludes. It tells us exactly what's coming. But yes, sir.
I mean, well, like in between those 400 years.
Yes, sir.
I think there's something there that we can. So it's to me, it's a little mysterious. I mean, I think God doesn't. It's not important that Noah, whatever Noah did,
Yeah.
200-300 years later, we didn't even know about it.
It wasn't of consequence.
Right.
Yeah.
But it is, for me, it's kind of going to, wow, what a very important figure
Yeah.
of the Bible.
It's almost,
go all the way to nothing
Yeah.
for 1/3 of his life.
it's almost good news. Because here's Noah. He does all this work. He builds an ark, 120 years. He preaches, nobody listens. He goes through the flood. And he has all this stuff. And then it's almost like Noah finally got to retire. You know, at 650, you know, finally got to just enjoy living on his property, and the boys maybe help take care of Mrs. Noah. We don't know. But yeah, it was of no consequence to the story. And again, the Old Testament, the patriarchal accounts very much are written that way. Lot, you know, we know their descendants, and if you're careful, you can organize the world around these accounts. You know, you can know where these people went, and there are maps out there if you want to look them up that show where the Hamites, the Japhethites, and that's what I was just saying, the Hamites tended towards, you know, northern Africa areas. I think the Japhethites went east and Shemites west. I think that's right. And you can basically take all of the lineages of the earth and generally boil them back to these three. And you will find that indeed the Hamites tend to be the backward, low life. I don't mean low life in a moral sense, though oftentimes that's true too. But they are the lowly nations of the planet. And so we're seeing interesting fodder for world history. But the point is to tell Israel's story to Israel. Moses writes this to the newly formed nation of Israel. And he's basically, again, this is biblical theology, not systematic. This is asking the question, what was the original purpose of Moses writing all of this? Well, Genesis isn't about the law at all. Exodus, we start seeing some of the law. Exodus is really the accounting of the nation from Egypt onward. But Genesis sets up the story for Exodus. And Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy are all about God's revelation of himself to those people during Moses' lifetime primarily, and how God made them his people and brought them into the promised land. And so when you look at the Torah, which is Moses' writings as a whole, Moses is writing this to his people so they know who they are and they know their story. And you can't tell that much history and spend a lot of time on all the players. Even if Moses knew more than he's writing, he couldn't have spent the time on it because he's trying to teach them who they are. And he also wanted to teach them who the Canaanites were. That's pretty clear here. Because at the time Moses is writing this, they're in the wilderness, they're in captivity, and Moses is going to die, Joshua's going to pick up the mantle, and they're going right into the promised land. And their first order of business is destroy the Canaanites by God's command. And so I think mentioning the father of Canaan twice here, the big picture theologically is let these Israelites know that these people are God's enemy, and that makes them your enemy because God is your God. And God calls them to destroy them. And again, they didn't. Solomon took a bunch of them as slaves, which was a failure. But
Well, I think we obviously know that during this 300 years of silence of Noah, we know that the world was being repopulated.
mm-hmm.
That part we do know.
Yeah.
That did occur. But one quick follow-up on something you began with, and I didn't want to get back to that, but you must have covered last week, we weren't here, but in verse 6, we talk about whoever sheds the blood of man shall his blood be shed.
Right.
You mentioned that being the capital punishment type. This is way pre-Mosaic law.
Yes.
Way pre-Mosaic. So, and I'm speaking from this from my background, who in this state we have capital punishment.
Mm-hmm.
And with death, the death penalty summed up. This is a law. This isn't Mosaic law. I don't know where to.
It's the law of God.
Yeah, I don't know where to put it. I don't know if that's a title other than the law of God.
Yeah.
Is it accurate for me to believe that this is forever until time ends?
The Noahic covenant is forever. There's nothing in the covenant that is conditional. And so, yes, this is what God expects. And again, he recodifies it in the law of Moses, and he recodifies it in the new law, in the law of freedom, the Jeremiah 31 law, the New Testament we call it. Capital punishment is upheld in the New Testament. Romans 9 is that right? 9 or 12? 9. It's all about obey the governing authorities. They don't bear the sword for nothing. And yes, that the idea of you killing a man is certainly codified pre-Mosaic as a grounds to forfeit your life. And capital punishment, there are a lot of people who argue against capital punishment from the Bible, but they don't, from the Bible, come up with their arguments. The Bible does not teach counter to that instruction, that if you kill a man, the penalty is you forfeit your life. That is biblical all the way back to Noah. What's really interesting is God was Cain's judge. Here, he's handing that off to human government. Okay, that's another part of the biblical theology picture, is when Cain killed Abel, he accounted directly to God, and God chose not to kill him. God has that prerogative, and he took it. He put a mark on him, whatever that meant, so that no one would kill him if they found him. But God spared Cain, and he's telling Noah, don't spare anyone for taking the life of man unnecessarily. And capital punishment, by the way, isn't the same as this. And by the time we get the law, a lot of people today who argue against capital punishment says, well, 10 Commandments say, you shall not kill. Actually, that's an English translation of, but it doesn't say you shall not kill. It says you shall not murder. You don't wantonly take life. The idea of capital punishment is all over those 10 Commandments. That, in fact, when they are expanded through the law of Moses, in the law of Moses' days, you could be put to death capitally for dishonoring your father and mother. Holy cow. We'd all be dead, you know. Nobody ever followed through on that, but there are a lot of capital offenses in the law of Moses. God's honor was absolutely at stake in that. But no, those are good questions. Yes, sir.
I have a few questions.
Okay.
And kind of want to expand on that. Kind of my understanding of like a lot of the Mosaic law, because I've seen a lot of arguments. Why would you serve a God that would kill you for disobeying your mom or whatever? I think the whole point of that, and correct me if I'm wrong, was grace. The
Mm-hmm.
whole point was you can forgive them
Well, and I think a good question to retort that with is, have you disrespected your mom? Well, sure. Did God kill you? Did you get dead and get better? Or did you not get dead? And so obviously they're setting themselves up for failure with that argument. But I get that. People like to presume they have more righteous goodwill than God does, but that all boils down to them not understanding the offense of sin.
But I've always found it interesting, though, that it's just like I feel like that was just teaching grace,
Yeah.
But
Tons of grace in the Old Testament.
I had two questions. One was there any reason why God said, "I will remember my covenant"? Obviously, He doesn't need to remember, but it just.
And that's a great question. I'm glad you asked that. Yes, God does that several times. God puts himself and establishes things in human terms for his human audience. But here's a good example. He tells Abraham to kill his son. God was never going to let him kill his son. That's evident from the story. But he put Abraham in the place where Abraham was willing to kill his son, draws a knife, and God says, stop. So God was never going to let Abraham kill Isaac. Isaac was the child of the promise. But God says after that, now I know that you are fully with me. You are willing to not withhold your only son. There's a lot going on with that because God was not willing to withhold his only son. But why did God say that? Did God not know before that what was going to happen? Of course he did. So to whose benefit did God say that? Abraham's. And to whose benefit does God say this? Noah's lineage, So God says things like that for our benefit, and he does that often. But I think that's the purpose in it, because you're right. God already knows, but we don't know. And I think he says things like that for our benefit, that we see and understand, more about ourselves and more about God through those kind of comments. All right.
My other question was, and I think that these verses are kind of specific, so, not to take it out of context, but, as we are to be disciples, we're going to get asked this question ourselves, so it's kind of good to be on the same page. But it's like Ezekiel 18:20 says, the soul that sinneth shall die, the son shall not bear the iniquity of the father, neither shall the father bear the iniquity of the son, the righteousness of the righteous upon him, the wickedness of the wicked upon him.
That's what I was talking about earlier.
Yeah, but it seems to contradict, I know it doesn't, but it seems to contradict, how several times, like you were saying, that through, third and fourth generation.
Mm-hmm.
Kind of the same thing. I think it's kind of on the same lines of, like, everybody's going to die. Like Romans 3:23 tells us, there's none righteous, no not one. So, but it seems to be more along the lines of every man's going to die because of his own sin. You don't die because your father sinned. You sin yourself.
Right.
It's kind of similar to what it says, but it is a little, like, how would you approach that if someone told you that that's,
That if God is God, he has a right to do whatever he wants to do with us. I use the chicken illustration, My wife and I talk about the chicken illustration sometimes, and it's not a perfect illustration. We have chickens, and all of my chickens are alive by the grace of my wife right now. Not my grace, her grace, because some of them don't lay anymore. I'm pretty sure my roosters are gay. They won't make babies. They won't, they're hardly laying. I'm thinking they look really good deep fried and on my plate. But she likes those chickens. And so we're probably going to get rid of those chickens, get some new chickens. They're expensive chickens. And she has a good point there. You don't deep fry a $50 chicken. Though I might like to know what a $50 chicken might taste like. But anyway, if I decided that I wanted to eat a chicken, which of my chickens has a right to tell me, oh, you don't have any claim over me? Eat him. Well, the answer is none of them. They're my chickens. They exist because I chose for them to exist, right? Now, I didn't create the chickens, but work with me. They're my chickens. And if I decide today we're having chicken, I got the water boiling, and I walk into the coop, no bird there has the ability or the right to thwart my will over selecting one for the table, right? Now, that's not a perfect illustration. But if God is God, by merit of being God, we are all made out of his dirt. We, the created, that's Romans 9. It's Romans 9. We don't have the right to look at the Creator who created us and say, why did you make me this way? You know, we don't get to say to God, being put here without any will or control of my own whatsoever, you don't have a right to judge me for the sin that I was unwittingly born into. You can say that. You can say that to the very last moment when the hatchet falls and your head rolls off. And then you spend all of eternity thinking, I guess he did have that right. You know, and that's really the way it is. If God is God, he owns the dirt we were made with, he owns us, and he has a right to tell us, here's how things are going to be. The second layer to that question is too deep for someone arguing on that level. On a deeper level, when you start really studying the Bible, you understand the nature of Revelation, that we didn't learn everything in the Garden of Eden. We didn't learn everything in the flood. The theology rolls out systematically over time. God revealed himself over time. And through that time, several fundamental changes were made to set the stage for the next, The Mosaic covenant codified God's standards. Christ fulfilled those standards, and now we're living in the new covenant. And even leading up to the Mosaic covenant, you know, God chose to do things the way he did. And part of that was, early on, he judged the children for the sins of the fathers, and later in Ezekiel, he said, I'm not going to do that anymore. That was his right. But that's not an answer someone who doesn't believe in a sovereign God's going to accept. You know, and one of the difficulties for all of us, and Tim, you know, I feel your compassion for the people who don't believe and wanting to convince them. Let's all remind ourselves that I cannot convince someone of the truthfulness of the gospel. All I can do is present it. You know, lay it out. Apologetics are wonderful. You can win arguments that way, but it doesn't convert them. They'll just change their argument and keep on rebelling. And so our job is to speak the truth, not to win arguments necessarily. Let the truth be the truth, and let them go home and chew on that if that's what's needed. All right, we're late. Let's go eat breakfast. Father, we love you and thank you for the opportunity to spend time today, Lord, in your word. And thank you for the way you've revealed yourself progressively through history so that we now have a completed canon and an understanding of who you are. Thank you for the food we're about to have. We love you and pray in Christ's name. Amen.